All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan. Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this month. And the Tzchus for Shlema for their niece, Chavet Zipora Bas Chaya Malka. To thank Shmuli and Libudinovitz for dedicating the Shiurim this month, and the Tzchus for Aliyah for the Neshama of Shmuli's father, Harav Peretz Avram, Ben Harav Binyamin Moshe Zichron Livracha. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Ira and Miriam Grossman, in honor of their 50th wedding anniversary. And to thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Barry and Lori Frank, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Lori's father, Yisrael Meir ben Chaim Tzvi, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas will have an Aliyah, the families in Nechama, and all of those who require a refuah will have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Kuf Ches 108. Actually, we have a lot to do today. We are picking up on Kuf Zayin 107b, and we actually left off at the second wide line. Beishamai Omrim Befanav. So remember again, the second machlokes in the Mishnah, actually no, not the second, but third machlokes in the Mishnah was whether or not miyun has to be done in the presence of the husband or not. So Beishamai paskin that halacha lamaisa. Beishamai said befanav, miyun has to be done in the presence of the husband, and Beis Hillel said bein befanav, bein shelo befanav, in front of him, not in front of him. Either way, it's okay. So it says the Gemara, second wide line, 107b. Tanya, Amrulem Beis Hillel Beishamai. So Beis Hillel said to Beishamai, what about Valo Pishon Hagamal? Miyane Ishto Shelo Befanav. But there was a story, there was an episode. This guy Pishon, the camel driver. So Pishon the Gamal, his wife did miyun with him, not in his presence. So Rabbi say you have to understand, we've been through Gemara enough to know that sometimes the most compelling thing you can do to prove a point is to quote an actual maisa, to show that something was actually done. So they say to Beishamai, they did miyun for Pishon not in the presence of his wife, or I should say, his wife did miyun not in his presence. Amrulem Beishamai Beisila Pishon Agamal Kimida Kifusha. So Beis Hillel says to Beishamai says to Beis Hillel, you can't bring a raya from Pishon the Kamal. Why not? If you look at Rashi, because Rashi says over here, Pishon Gamal was like a Mida Kifusha Marad. Look at Rashi. Kimida Kifuya Marad Lashon Ona. Kimode Bushuli Hamida. So I'll say this was an expression for someone who measures out produce in a flawed utensil. So it's an expression. So in other words, Pishon is someone who measured out in a flawed utensil. Meaning what? Pishon himself wasn't a good guy. Finish Rashi. Finish Rashi. Lefichach madadu lo gemida kafusha. Shabbat says, so apparently, this guy Pishon was mistreating his wife's nichsei malug. Like we saw in yesterday's daf, a concern that could occur with miyun. He was misappropriating and misusing his wife's property. So because he was misusing the property, therefore what they wanted to get her out of this marriage as quickly as possible, and therefore allowed for miyun even not in his presence. Midika achal peri, so the Gemara says, Midika achal peri pshita nesuhi. Now, interestingly enough, I will say, here's what's fascinating. Okay, I could buy that. In other words, remember again, Beishamai is coming along and saying miyun could only be done in the presence of the husband. Now the Gemara says we have a story with this guy Pishon where we are allowing miyun not in his presence. To which the Gemara says, okay, it's because he wasn't a good guy, he wasn't acting appropriately. That's why we allowed for, specifically in the property realm, that's why we allow for miyun. To which the Gemara makes an amazing observation. But one second, the fact that he is consuming his wife's nichsei malug tells me that what Rabbi say, they were married. There was nisuin. Because remember again, a husband only gets to enjoy his wife's nichsei malug after nisuin. He only gets peros after nisuin. Now I will say, what did Beis Shammai say in yesterday's daf? You could only do miyun from erusin, not from nisuin. So how is Beis Shammai, forget about not in his presence, how is Beis Shammai even allowing miyun to occur in this scenario? To which the Gemara says, listen to this. So trei kitri avdube. Ultimately, again, look at Rashi. Shnei kisharim asu alav l'raso. Literally, they made two knots against Pishon. So it's an expression. In other words, that Pishon acted in an inappropriate way, and therefore, again, Chazal took two liberties in allowing his wife to go ahead and perform miyun. Liberty number one is that they allowed her to perform miyun not in his presence. Liberty number two is they allowed for miyun even during nisuin. Incredible. Rabosai, so it makes sense because remember, as we saw before in yesterday's daf, according to Beis Shammai, the inability to perform miyun after nisuin was rabbinic legislation. So essentially, again, what the Gemara is saying over here, in a case of need, we'll lift the rabbinic legislation and allow for miyun even from nisuin. Incredible. Beis Shammai omrim bifnei bezdin. So Beis Shammai said that the miyun has to happen in front of a bezdin. Ultimately, again, Beis Hillel says it doesn't. Nan hasam hachalitza v'miyun b'shlosha. Chalitza and miyun require three people. So mantana. Whose opinion is this? Amarabba, Beis Shammai. It's Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai holds that miyun requires a bezdin. Three. Abai Amar no. Afilu tema Beis Hillel. Even Beis Hillel agrees. Ad kan lo kama Beis Hillel ela delo ba'inan mumchin aval shlosha ba'inan. They both say, just to be clear, when Beis Hillel says that you do not require a bezdin, what was Beis Hillel saying? You don't require mumchin. You don't require experts. But halacha lemaisa, you still require a group of three. And that's the Gemara saying over here. Avashlosha ba'inan kidesanya, Beis Shammai omrim, bifnei bezdin, Beis Hillel omrim, bifnei bezdin, shelo bifnei bezdin. Beis Shammai says miyun has to happen in front of a bezdin. Beis Hillel says in front of a bezdin, not in front of a bezdin. Ve'elu modim shetzarech shlosha. I will say very important. So when the Mishnah says that Beis Shammai is requiring a bezdin, and Beis Hillel doesn't require a bezdin, what's their machlokes? Do you require mumchin? Do you require people who are experts in halacha? According to Beis Hillel, the answer is no, you just need three. According to Beis Shammai, the answer is yes. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon machshir mishnayim. So Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon hold that you only need two. Rabbi Yossi bar Yumi, Rav Nachman, halacha osa hazog. Rabbi Yossi bar Yumi, Rav Nachman said the halacha follows this pair. In other words, the pair referring to Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon, who only require two. Now, so we know we don't paskin that way. Halacha so we paskin that chalitza or miyun like chalitza requires a bezdin, requires three. Now again, it doesn't require dayanim mumchin, doesn't require expert judges. It just requires what? It just requires people who are capable. In the case of chalitza, capable of feeding the psukim. In the case of miyun, people who are capable of administering the process, as we'll see in the next Mishnah. Beautiful. Beis Shammai omrim temayin. So the Mishnah ended off with a strange statement. So remember again, the Mishnah said like this. The Mishnah dealt with the following scenario. I'm just quoting to you from the Mishnah. If a girl does miyun, so again, Rachel is married off by her brother, or by her, let's call by her mother, to Ruvain. Okay, she's a kitana, she has kiddushay dirabanan. Now she decides, I don't want this anymore. So she does miyun. Okay, so the Mishnah said, and now she's still a kitana. Afilu dalid v'hei pamim. So according to Beis Hillel, she could repeat the process of getting married as a kitana and dissolving marriages through miyun even 4 or 5 times, which is another way of saying what? Her brother or her mother can marry her off as many times as they want while she's a kitana, and she has the ability to utilize miyun to dissolve each of those marriages. So Beis Shammai says, Ein benos Yisrael hefker. Beis Shammai is against that practice. He says, no, it's not appropriate. Rather, Ella, mema'enes umamtenes achatik david temayin v'tinase. So the Lashon of the Mishnah is like this. Beis Shammai says, after she does miyun, here's what she should do. She shouldn't get married again. She should wait until she becomes an adult, until she becomes a gedola. Now his lashon over here is wait until she gets older. V'temayin, do miyun, and then she should get married. So asks the Gemara, she should do miyun. It sounds like Beis Shammai is saying she has to do miyun again twice. Like she does miyun when she's a ketana to dissolve the marriage, and then it sounds like she has to do miyun again at some point. The Gemara says, why does she have to do miyun? She already did miyun. Amar Shmuel, no. Shmuel says what Beis Shammai is saying something very interesting is that right before she becomes an adult, she has to reaffirm her miyun status. She has to reaffirm, I really want the miyun. Look at Rashi. Rod sa'ani shema chazra. So we'll say, so again, literally, right before she becomes a gedola, she reaffirms that the miyun she did that she was younger was in fact the miyun that she wants. Okay? Ula amar tarti katani. Ula says, no. There's two cases in the Mishnah. What are the two cases in the Mishnah? Oshe tima'in v'tagdil v'te'ares. Either A, she can go ahead and do miyun, and according to Beis Shammai, she should wait, right? She should wait, ultimately again, and then when she gets older, she could do erisin. Oshe tima'in v'tinase la'alter. Or at the end of the day, she could get remarried, but she has to do nisuin immediately. Now, both say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Tarti katani, lav lemechadr lama'in zimnach risi. Beis Shammai is not coming to say that she has to do miyun a second time. Rather, Beis Shammai is outlining two possibilities. Ela tarti mili ninhu, mema'enes mamtenes mila aris la'achrat shetagdil, kadesh lo tachser v'temayin b'sheni. So we'll say, option number one is after she does miyun as a ketana, what are her options? She waits. No more marriage when you're a ketana. Wait till you become a gedola, and you'll get married in a normal fashion. Oh, imratzasad lihinase mima'enes bebal v'tinase la'alter the sulam mima'enes lebeis Shammai. Or, the second possibility is, as a ketana, she can get remarried. But what? She has to do nisuin immediately. Why, Rabbi? Why nisuin immediately? Because according to Beis Shammai, what happens after a girl does nisuin? No more miyun. What Beis Shammai is looking to avoid is repeated acts of miyun. He says it looks immoral. It doesn't look right if a girl's going to constantly getting into marriages and constantly dissolving them. So therefore, again, if her mother married her off and she decided to do miyun, which is her right, now she's unmarried. There are two options. Option one, wait to get married until you become a gedola and could affect regular marriage. Option number two is if you are insistent on getting married again as a ketana, or someone's insistent on marrying her off again as a ketana, marry her off, must do nisuin immediately, because according to Beis Shammai, must do nisuin immediately, because according to Beis Shammai, no miyun after nisuin. So it says the Gemara Bishlam Ula Hainu Diktani Achetag Vilvatinase. According to it makes sense. That's why the Mishnah says until she gets older and does nisuin. Ela l'Shmuel ad shetagdil v'tomar mibayle. But according to Shmuel, who says that she has to reaffirm the miyun, it should say ad shetagdil v'tomar, that she should grow up until she grows up and reaffirms her commitment to the miyun. Enachinami, the Gemara says kasha. Good question. Then I both say halacha l'maisa. We paskin like Beis Hillel down the line in this Mishnah. So even in this last case, Rabbi say, we actually hold that a girl as a ketana could get married multiple times. And remember, any marriage that is going to be affected on her behalf as a ketana, assuming it's not her father, because her father could affect biblical marriage. Kiddushay Daraisa, it's going to be her mother or her father, mother or her brother. They have the ability only to affect rabbinic kiddushin. And Einach Inami, under those circumstances, she could do miyun even 4 or 5 times. Okay, both say weiter. So both say this is an interesting question, which is, who is the ketana that we're talking about who has the ability to do miyun? In other words, Rabbi say, what we're saying is like this. We have to assume that miyun itself requires some level of das. Right, some level of das. Even though she's a ketana, right, there has to be some level of das associated with it. It says, the Rabbi said this is incredibly important. Says the Mishnah, when is there miyun? Miyun only takes place when the girl was married off with her consent. Whatever consent a minor could have, she's married off with her consent. Aval, listen to this. However, he siua shelo ledaita. But let's say her mother or her brother married her off against her will or without her consent. Eina tzricha l'mayin. She does not need miyun. Now I will say, what does it mean she doesn't need miyun? Why doesn't she need miyun? There's no marriage. It's fascinating. There's no marriage. So the ability, I will say, by the way, I will point out over here, this is different than the ability of a father to betroth his minor daughter, where a father has the ability to do it even against her will. A brother or a mother only have the ability to do it with her consent, to the point that if they arrange a relationship with her without her consent, there's no miyun because there's no marriage. So the Gemara Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus Omer, Kol tinokes she'eni yachol. So we'll say that's first element, consent. Next, Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus Omer, Kol tinokes she'eni yachol lishmor kiddusheha ina tzricha l'mayin. Rabbi, this is very interesting. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus says, how old does she have to be? She has to be at least old enough to be able to watch over the article that she received for Kiddushin. In other words, Rabbi say, if she gets a ring, for argument's sake, for Kiddushin, and she's so young that she can't even keep track of it, right? She can't even hold on to her stuff, that's too young to be able to affect any level of Kiddushin. But so whenever you see the Lashon of Eina Tzrich L'mayim, that she doesn't need miyun, saying she doesn't need miyun is another way to say what? Another way to say what? There's no marriage. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar Omer, Ein Maise Ketana Klum, Ela Kimafuta. So Rabbi Lazar says, in general, anything done to a ketana has no halachic relevance. Rather, again, relations with a ketana is not marriage, but rather will be like a mafuta. It's treated like someone who seduces a woman. We'll see what that statement means. Bas Yisrael Kohen, Lo Tol Chabat. Similarly, again, about say, if a Bas Yisrael, again, we're talking about now in a situation, according to Rabbi Lazar, or it's changed to Rabbi Eliezer, ultimately, again, where there is no marriage to a ketana, and it's treated like a mafuta, it's treated like a woman who is seduced. Therefore, again, if she's a Bas Yisrael, who's quote-unquote married to a Kohen, because that marriage is not a marriage, lo socha v'truma. Bas Kohen li Yisrael, if the girl is a Bas Kohen who marries Yisrael, tocha v'truma, she could continue to eat truma. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, kol hakava shehi min ha'ish, kilu hi ishto. So Rabbi say, we'll see what this statement means, but it literally translated, anytime the akava is like the ikov, the holding back. I don't know, we'll use that word we'll use that phrase. Anytime the holding back is from the man, she is considered his wife. Ultimately, anytime that the holding back is not from the man, it is as if she is not his wife. The Gemara is going to define that statement. Says the Gemara, Tana, boss, listen to this. Barishona hayu kosvin get mion. So now here's what's interesting. The Mishnah defined kind of who is subject to the process of miyun, or how this type of marriage that is subject to miyun takes place. What the Gemara now is going to get into is, what does miyun look like? Because what it sounds like is, what is miyun? What is miyun? The girl goes over to her husband and she says, I don't want to marry to you anymore. Right? Now again, we established in the previous Mishnah that it sounds like it has to be done bifanav, right? Actually, I should say, no, it's not true, because it has like Beis Hillel, even shalom bifanav, but sounds like it requires a Beis Din, right? Or at least three people. But what's the process? Listen to this. I remember Rabbi said, "Bereshana hayu kosvin get miyun." They both said they used to write for a woman a get miyun, a miyun document. What did it say in the miyun document? So the Gemara says, "Lo ra'ina bei, v'lo tzavina bei, v'les ana bay lehisnas v'bei." I don't want you, right? I don't desire you. I don't want to be married to you. Kevan dechazu denafish dibura. Since ultimately they saw that it was a lot of words, Amri, top of Kofchas, we'll see what it means in a lot of words, Asi, lachlufe begita. They will say they were concerned that people would confuse this with a regular case of get. Now I will say, what's the issue over here? The truth is, it sounds funny because this is a relatively short document, but Lamaisa already has too many words. So I will say they were concerned that writing this type of document would lead people to get confused with a regular get, and even an unexperienced. Now I will say for this, you don't need an experienced sofer. For a regular get, you do require an experienced sofer. People were concerned that people will say the same way that you don't need an experienced sofer for a get of miyun, you also don't need an experienced sofer for a get for gittin. Takinu haki, this is what they instituted. Biyon ploni, mirna plonis pas ploni. Be'anpina ba'anpina. Both say here it is. So they instituted a shorthand. Here's the shorthand. On so-and-so day, right, plonis bas ploni, this woman, the daughter of so-and-so, did miyun in front of us. That's it. Right? That's the whole document. Ezu miyun. They both say, so again, what we see from this, which is very important, is that halacha lamaisa, miyun does have a document. A short document, but a document nevertheless. Tanrabanan will say, third lie down, kuf chesam dalef. Tanrabanan, ezehu miyun. What is miyun? Amra efshi baploni baili, efshi b'kiddushin shekidshuni, imi va'achi. So we'll say, a woman says, I don't want my husband, or I don't want this marriage that my mother or my brother affected on my behalf. That's miyun. Good. We'll see, that's like straight out miyun. Yes, sir. Yes, Al came even more. Amra Yehuda afilu yosheves ba'apirion v'oleches mi beis aviha lebeis baila. Bosa, listen to this. Va'amra yef she beploni baili zeu miun. Bosa, to even one better. I mean, not better. Interesting. Right? Bosa, let's say she's at the chasana. She's at the chasana. Right? She's in the big bridal chair. Right? They're carrying around. She's dancing. Right? The carving stations are open, and she says, "You know what? I don't want this guy. I don't want this guy." That's miyun. That's miyun. Yes, I came. Or they have, let's say she's married. They have company in the house. She's serving the company. The company says, "How are things?" She says, "I really don't want to be married to this guy." Right? That's also a little it's awkward, right? But Lamaisa, that's miyun as well. Then I both say, what's the chiddush of these cases? The chiddush of these cases is she's acting in a normal marital capacity. In other words, she's sitting on the big bridal chair. She's serving company in her home. So the Gemara says, even though her words don't match the context, in other words, like contextually, looks like she's fine, she's married. We don't look at the context, we look at her words. And if in her words she is saying, "I don't want to be married to this man," then Allah Chalamai said that's miyun. Yes, okay, and listen to this. Another case. So listen to this. Let's say her husband sent her to the store to pick something up, to pick up his stuff. Va'amra, and she says, "Ef shiba ploni baili," she says, "I don't want to be married to my husband. Ein lecha miyun gadol mizah." This is miyun. Then I will say, what's the chiddush in this case? See, in this case, he sent her on an errand, right? So you might know why is she saying, "I don't want to be married to this guy"? Why is she saying it? She's annoyed at him. She's annoyed at him, right? Even though you might say that she's saying it because she's annoyed at him, it's interesting. We don't really look deeper into her words. If this girl expresses a desire to be out of this marriage, then halacha l'maisa, ultimately, she's out of the marriage. Incredible. I will say, by the way, I'll just point out something amazing, just fascinating to contemplate. And I will say, one of the greatest, like contemporary challenges. It's not contemporary. Is the concept of aguna, right? The idea that divorce, regular divorce, is really a male-dominated process. In other words, the husband controls the get. Almost entirely. It's fascinating to see how here you have a case of miyun, and here all we do is we look at what the woman says, the girl says. If she says, "I want out," we want out, which I both say is such a fascinating thing, because sometimes the taina that people have is that the Rabbanim, whoever the Rabbanim are, don't care enough about the plight of women, therefore don't do anything about aguna. And I will say, I just want to point out something interesting. Miyun is a rabbinic process. And if you look at the way miyun works, is as soon as the girl says she wants out, she's out. She's out. That's the way Chazal structured the process. Even though, again, she's serving company tea, she says she wants out. I'm just pointing out that sometimes it's important to understand that there's a system that is bigger than any Rav or any posek or any quote-unquote group of Rabbanim. Sometimes there's a system. We don't understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu structured the get system the way he structured it. Certainly it seems like it's overwhelmingly slanted in the direction and the favor of, it's hard to understand what the Chachmas Habore was with it. But just to understand that sometimes an inability to find a comprehensive solution doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lack of empathy or a lack of desire to try to work through something. Vaharaya, when Chazal control the process, look what it looks like. In other words, the husband has no control over here. The woman has all the control over here. And again, the marriage is dissolved just with a couple of words, no matter what the context is. Just important, sometimes an inability to find a comprehensive solution doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lack of ratzon or a lack of empathy involved. The Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus Omer Kol Tinokes. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel. Halacha Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus. The halacha is like Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus. So the Gemara says, Kitana Shalomi and Amda Venise. So listen to this case. This is fascinating. So say, let's say you have the following scenario. A girl, Kitana, who didn't do miyun, but she goes ahead and she marries someone else. So it's just a pretty wild case, right? So Rachel, we'll call the Rachel, is married to Ruvain. And then what happens? She doesn't do miyun. Instead, what does she do? she goes and she marries Shimon. She goes and she marries Shimon. To which the Gemara says, Amda v'niseis mishum Yehuda ben Beseira Amru nisiua hein minu eha. I will say, how do we view this? She married Shimon. She's married to Reuven. I will say, how do we view her marriage to Shimon as what? As miyun to Reuven. Incredible. Correct. But remember, this is important. Miyun. Remember, we had a previous machlokes, Beishan and Beis Hillel. Does miyun work only in erisin or nisuin? Also, let's assume right now we paskin like Beis Hillel, so miyun even works from nisuin, which means that she's fully married to Reuven. Beis Shammai would read this as his only kiddushin, but we're assuming it's nisuin also. So we'll say, so now it's a wild case. So now she was married to Reuven, and now she marries Shimon. So we'll say, so the Gemara says over here, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, her acceptance of kiddushin from Shimon is in and of itself miyun to Reuven. So we'll say that's nisuin. What happens if she only accepted kiddushin from Shimon? Would that effectively be miyun to Reuven as well? Tashma, kitana shlomi and ava amden eskacha. If a kitana didn't do miyun, but she accepted kiddushin from a second man, Mishra Yehuda ben Beseira Omer kiddusha hein mi'uneha. So Abba say this is a wild case. So now Abba say after we just got finished saying that miyun is pretty much any time that she comes along and she says, I don't want this marriage. Once she says it, ultimately again, the marriage is done. Now this is even an additional level. Even though she never explicitly articulates that she doesn't want the marriage, but behaviorally, she does something which indicates that she is clearly done with the first marriage. That's miyun also. So she's married to Reuven, again, rabbinic marriage. Her mother married her off to Reuven. She now comes along and what? Accepts kiddushin from Shimon. The act of acceptance of kiddushin from Shimon is miyun on the marriage to Reuven. Wild. Pligi Rabbanan Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira olo. Do the Rabbanan argue Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira or not? Imtim silomar b'kiddushin or afilu b'nisuin. And if they argue, do they only argue on kiddushin or also nisuin? Imtim silomar pligi. And if they do argue afilu b'nisuin, halacha kamoso and halacha kamoso. Rabbi say who does the halacha follow? Imtim silomar halacha kimoso. And if you say the halacha follows him, then is it b'nisuin or afilu b'kiddushin? So we'll say, so what's the halacha? So Tashma Rabbi Yehuda ben Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. The halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. So let's remember again, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira is of the opinion he holds that halacha lamaisa miyun could be affected even behaviorally. So if Rachel comes along and accepts kiddushin from Shimon, the act of acceptance from kiddushin from Shimon is miyun to Reuven. So the Gemara said the fact that it says halacha mechlal de pligi. Someone's arguing. The Rabbanan are arguing. V'akati tibay lecha to have an esiba meikara or dil mekadsha. And then I will say again, this was a question that Greg raised before. So I will say, now I still have a question. In her marriage to Reuven, was there kiddushin with Reuven, or was there just kiddushin, or was there nisuin? Tashma the kal say the avdon imrod. I will say, this reference is Bekarux. Remember again the story we had just two days ago with Avdon and Rabbi Shema Rabbi Yossi, right? Avdon was the one who insulted Rabbi Shema Rabbi Yossi publicly when Rabbi Yossi was slow getting to the shir of Rabbi. And remember again, the Gemara there had a little bit of a different version, but here it sounds like it's the same story. Kal say the Avdon Imrod. The daughters-in-law of Avdon rebelled against their husband. I will say, in general, when we hear imrod, that generally means lashon of they refuse to be intimate with their husbands. So the Gemara says, Shadar Rabbi, Zugei Rabban Dikinu. So Rabbi sent out a delegation to see what was going on. Amar lahu nashi. So say, so the women, right? So the daughters-in-law of Avdon are standing with a group of women. Chazu gavraychu dakaasi. They saw men who were coming. The women thought, Amar lahu nehavo gavra. So what happened? Chazu gavraychu dakasu. So the women saw, this group of women saw men who were approaching. The women thought that it was the husbands of the daughters-in-law of Avdon. All right, there's a long-winded way of saying. They thought it was the sons of Avdon who were coming. So they said to the two girls, so they said to the two daughters-in-law, look, your husbands are coming. What did the girls say? Amar lahu nehavu gavraychu didachu. They should be your husbands. It's okay, we don't need them, they could be your husbands. Amar Rabbi, ein lecha miyun gadol mizeh. Rabbi said, that's miyun. That's miyun. Any expression of an unwillingness to be married anymore is miyun. So the Gemara says, my love to have a nesiba. Now, ours, we're talking about a case of nisuin, and you see again that halacha lamaisa. First of all, you see that you could do miyun even from nisuin. Lo to have a mekache kiddushin. No, it was just kiddushin. Halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira afil ben nisuin dekama. And I will say the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Rabbi say halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Namely what? Namely what Rabbi say that halacha lamaisa, if a ketana accepts kiddushin from another man, accepts kiddushin from a second husband, even if she had nisuin with the first husband, the act of acceptance of kiddushin from a second husband is effectively miyun on her first marriage. Absolutely wild. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Amri B'Rav Shmuel, Chozrena Kol Tzadi Chachamim, V'lo Matzasi Adam Sheshvu Midosa B'Ketana Rabbi Elazar. So what is this? Rabbi Yehuda said to Rabbi Yehuda name of Shmuel, I've chazered over these halachas, and I have found no one who has as thorough of a shita in this inyan as Rabbi Elazar. Shasar Rabbi Elazar, ki metayeles imo b'chatzer, va'omedes mecheko, v'toveles va'ocheles b'truma la'erev. Because Rabbi say, in Rabbi Elazar's model, because remember again, what did Rabbi Elazar say in the Mishnah? He said, Ein maise ketana klum ela kimafuta. So Rabbi Elazar really holds that there's no semblance of marriage in this particular situation. So literally again, he says, it's as if she's strolling with him in the garden, which is a reference to relations. Omedes becheko, she gets up, goes to the mikvah, and could eat truma of her father's home that evening. Tanya, let's analyze this. Rabbi Elazar says, Ein maise ketana klum. At the end, we'll say first of the widest lines. The actions of a ketana are meaningless. Ve'ein ba'ala zakai. So we'll say, therefore, ultimately, again, what Rabbi Elazar is really saying is that halacha l'maisa, the whole semblance of marriage with a ketana, not when the father's marrying or off, right? When the mother or brother is not really a marriage. It's not really a marriage. It's an arrangement, but it's not a marriage. Therefore, a husband is not entitled to anything she finds. Not to her earnings. Can't annul her nadarim. Yarsha doesn't inherit her. Can't become tamiter if he's a kohen. She is not like his wife in any way. The only thing is she needs miyun. So we'll say, it says fast, according to Rabbi Elazar, essentially, what Chazal kind of created over here, and we'll say, this is not how he passed halacha l'maisa, but what Chazal created over here is essentially like an arrangement. It's an arrangement. What does the arrangement do? The arrangement gives this girl a certain level of safety and security. Physical safety, material safety, and the one thing her husband does have to do is what? He has to feed her and clothe her, take care of her, but it's not marriage. It's not marriage. And because it's an arrangement, therefore the only thing it really needs in order to dissolve it is miyun. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Baila zakab mitziyasa, he's entitled to what she finds. O my down to her earnings, Bafar Sadaran to annul her vows. The Yarshe, he inherits, certain tamila becomes tamitar. Klalo shal davar, hareyuki ishto lechal davar, ela shiyotze b'miyun. So I will say, this is the fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar is saying, it's not marriage. It's not marriage. V'haraya, none of the regular details of marriage apply. He doesn't get her earnings. He doesn't tell you, right? He's not entitled to what she finds. Can't annul her vows. Can't become tamitar. It's an arrangement. And it's an arrangement that could simply be annulled through miyun. Rabbi Yoshua says, no, it's marriage. It's marriage. It's regular marriage. Just the only difference is that it doesn't need a get. It only requires miyun. So Amar Rabbi says, near to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. I think Rabbi Eliezer is correct over Rabbi Yoshua. So Rabbi Eliezer, hishva midosav bikitana, Rabbi Yoshua chalak. Because Rabbi Eliezer, his shita is consistent, whereas Rabbi Yoshua makes distinctions. My chalak, where does Rabbi Yoshua make distinctions? I ishto hiti by get. Because Rabbi Yoshua, if you really hold that a kitana is the wife of this man, then what? She should need a get. Why is miyun enough? So the Gemara says, one second, Rabbi Eliezer nami ilavish toi miyun nami lotibai. But you can say something, Rabbi Eliezer, if she's not his wife, then what? Then why should it even require miyun? No, that's not fair. Because we'll say, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's still an arrangement. So because there is a structured arrangement, there has to be some mechanism of dissolution. To just say that she just leaves the house and that's it, that's the end, that doesn't make any sense. Good. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, Hechi dami akava shemin aish, the akava she'ena minish. So remember again, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov said that halacha l'maisa, if the akava is because of the man, ultimately, again, she is still his wife. If the akava is not from the man, then ultimately she's not. What does this mean? So we'll say, Hechi dami akava shemin aish, the akava she'ena min aish. Here we go. Rabbi Shmuel. Tavua li nase. Supposed to listen to this. Rachel's married to Ruvain. Rachel's married to Ruvain. Kiddushay Kitana. Her brother married her off. Fine. So what happens? Someone proposes another shidduch. Va'amra machmas ploni baili zoya kavashi minaish. She says, no, I can't because I'm married. So supposed to say she's remaining in her marriage ultimately again because of her husband. Then that's not miyun. She's solidifying the fact that she's married to Ruvain. Machmas b'nei adam she'ena muganali. If she says, well, I would entertain the shidduch, but you're not bringing forth any proposals, right? I'm unimpressed. So ultimately, the Gemara suggests that's miyun. Why? Because what is she saying? I don't really want to be married to Ruvain anymore. But the only reason I'm staying married to Ruvain is why? Because you haven't brought up anyone else who is suitable. That's ultimately again miyun. Zoya kava she'ena min aish. Abaye bar Avin, Rabbi Chanina bar Avin, Darmi Tarvayu, Nasan la get zohi kava shu min aish. Vu asa b'kravosel, v'asa b'kravav. If he gave her a get, I both say this is considered to be a situation that is generated by the man, and therefore again she will be usher to his relatives, and he's usher in her relatives. Upasla min kahuna, and ultimately again she's usher from kuna. Miyanabo, if she did miyun, however, zoya kava she'ena min aish, the mutar kava. So it's very interesting. With miyun, remember what does miyun effectively do? It's not just the pshat that miyun dissolves the marriage. What does miyun actually do? It makes the marriage as if it never happened. And therefore what? And therefore, ultimately, again, she is permitted to his relatives. He's permitted to her relatives. Lo pasla min hakuna, and she is not pasla from marrying into the kuna. So the Gemara says, "Hakatani lekaman hamima enes beish himu teres bekravosel v'himu teres bekravav v'lo pasla min hakuna." Bro, so we're going to learn this. Actually, this is mamish the next mishnah. That if you do miyun, ultimately, again, she is permitted to marry his relatives. He's permitted to marry her relatives. And she is not possible from kuna. Nasan la get. But if he gives her a get, and I both say, even though they don't need a get, right? Let's say the husband gives her a get. Reuven's married to Rachel. Rachel's a kitana. She doesn't need a get. All she needs is meal. But let's say he gave her a get. Halacha l'maisa, huasa b'kravosel, v'yasa b'kravav, upasla min hakahuna. Ultimately, again, I will say, in that situation, then what? She becomes prohibited to his relatives, he becomes prohibited to her relatives, and halacha l'maisa, she is pulsa from the Quran. To which the Gemara says, you're right, it's not redundant, perushe kamefarish. Ultimately, the Bryce is coming to explain the Mishnah. I will say, and that's a good segue to the next Mishnah. So I will say, so again, halacha l'maisa, what we walk away from this particular Mishnah is a fascinating idea. Namely, that what? That miyun, first of all, that miyun doesn't have to be something explicitly stated. You could have what's called contextual miyun. What's contextual miyun? If she does something which clearly indicates that she is done with the first marriage, that's miyun. So I both say, whether it's that she casually says something at her chasana, entertaining company, while at the store, that's miyun. Or I both say what? She accepts kiddushin from another man. Ein miyun gidola mizo. Quite incredibly fascinating. So we'll say good. We also saw again halacha l'maisa, fundamental halacha of Rabbi Yoshua. They both say just as important because then we're going to go on. How do we paskin? What is miyun? What is kiddushay kitana? Is kiddushay kitana an arrangement like Rabbi Eliezer, or is it a marriage like Rabbi Yoshua? And the answer is it's a marriage like Rabbi Yoshua. It is a marriage. Just the difference is because it's a rabbinic marriage. It's a marriage that doesn't require a get. It's a marriage that only requires miyun. But this is important to understand. It's not simply an arrangement. It is an actual halachic marriage. Sorry, good. Let's go back there. Mishnah. Hamima enes beish. A woman does miyun with a man. Who mutar b'kravosel. V'hi mutar b'kravav. This is exactly what we just said before, right? So miyun essentially undoes the marriage. She's permitted to marry his relatives. He's permitted to marry her relatives, and she is not psula min hakuna. So in other words, now if she wants to marry a kohen, totally eligible. Nasan la get, but if he gives her a get, Hu asa b'krovosel v'asura b'krovav upasla min hakuna. If there's a get, then einachinami, she's going to be asur to his relatives, he's going to be asur to her relatives, and she's psula from kuna. Nasan laget v'echzira. We'll say, listen to this case. Reuven's married to Rachel, right? So Rachel is a ketana. Rachel's a ketana. So what happens? Rabbi say, Reuven gives Rachel a get, and then what happens? Then he remarries her. And then what? Miyonabo. Then she does miyon. Clearly not a good shidduch, right? They'll say, but Allah Chalamais again, right? So he marries her, Kiddushay Ketana, divorces her with a get, really unnecessary, but gives her a get, remarries her, she's still a Ketana. Now she does miyon. What's the halacha? V'niseis la'acher, and I will say now she goes in and marries someone else. V'nis amrla onis garsha, and she's widowed or divorced from the second husband. Muteres lachzor lo, she could return back to the first husband. So we'll say, see what happened over here? Right? Reuven married Rachel, Kiddushay Ketana. He divorces her with a get. Not necessarily everybody does it. Remarries her. Then she does miyun. Okay, marriage is done. Now she marries Shimon. Shimon dies. The Mishnah says that halacha l'maisa, Reuven is permitted to go ahead and remarry Rachel. And I will say, what's the incredible chiddush in that? Is that machzer gushaso? You're not allowed to marry a woman, right? After you divorce a woman and she marries someone else, you're not allowed to remarry her. Rather, Rabbi say, what's the novelty in the Mishnah? The fact that Reuven and Rachel, their marriage was ultimately dissolved. How? Through miyun, right? It's as if the marriage never happened, right? Therefore, again, when she marries Shimon, subsequently divorces, or Shimon dies, she can remarry Reuven. Now, the greater chiddush is that what? That with Reuven, she also had a get. So what it sounds like from the Mishnah is that the miyun didn't just dissolve the marriage, but the miyun also did what? Erased all marriage history. Oh, who wouldn't like an opportunity like that sometimes to erase marriage history and start again? Right? So the mice again erases all marriage history, including that get. And that's why she's permitted to go ahead and remarry Reuven. So the Gemara says, conversely, if Reuven married Rachel, Kiddushay Ketana, she did miyun, then they decided to get remarried. Then what? Then he divorced her again, but with a get. Now she's still a Ketana this whole time. Now she marries Shimon, is widowed from Shimon. Now she can't remarry Reuven. Why, Rabbi say? Why? Because of that get. So the Gemara says, Asur say Amadeus. So Zaklau, this is the rule. Get achar miyun asura lachzor lo. Miyun achar get muteres lachzor lo. So we'll say this is the rule. If there's a get after miyun, then Rabbi say essentially what we look at this couple is as a divorced couple. We'll say even though again it's not really a get, right? It's not a real get. Why isn't that a real get? Because remember this is all Kiddushay Ketana. So we'll say if the marriage ended with a get, we treat them like a divorced couple, which we'll say means what? Which means what? If now Rachel goes on to marry someone else and that marriage falls apart because of death or divorce, she cannot remarry Reuven. However, again, if the marriage ended off with miyun, even if there was a get somewhere in that process, right? And Rachel now marries Shimon, and that marriage ends, she can come back to Reuven. So as long as her marriage with Reuven ended with miyun, it essentially dissolves all previous marital history. She can come back to Reuven. But if the marriage with Reuven ended with a get, ultimately she cannot come back to Reuven. So the Gemara says, miyunach aget mutaris lachzor lo. Good. So the Gemara says, enes peish v'niseis la'achar. If a woman does miyun with her husband, and then she goes in and she gets married to someone else, v'girsha la'achar umiyanabo. Right? Umiyanabo la'achar. I will say this is a case of repeated husbands. Right? So now, not repeated husbands, multiple husbands. Right? So a woman gets married to a man, she marries someone else, v'girsha, then she gets divorced, v'girsh, right? La'achar umiyanabo. And then she gets married to someone else, does miyun, la'achar v'girsha, and then she goes and does gerusha with someone else. So we'll say, what's that locha? Ze'aklal, kol sheyotza mimena beget, asur lachzor lo. B'miyun mutaris lachzor. So we'll say, that's just an expanded case of the previous rule. Essentially, Rabbi say, to say a little bit more succinctly, there's a din of machzer grushaso, right? That halacha l'maisa, after you divorced the woman and she married someone else, you cannot remarry her. What the Mishnah is essentially highlighting to us is that halacha only applies when the marriage ends with a get. But if the marriage ends with miyun, you are permitted to remarry that woman even if she subsequently married someone else. And I both say the logic is very simple, because that's how miyun works. Miyun, see, a get severs a relationship. Miyun dissolves or erases a relationship. And that is an incredibly profound distinction. Because halacha lamaisa, when the marriage ended with a get, if the wife subsequently married someone else, the first husband cannot take her back. But if the marriage ended with miyun, no matter how many men she married in the interim, that first husband is permitted to take her back. Incredible. And I both say the further novelty which you're going to discuss is it's even more than that. It's not just the pshat that if the marriage ended with miyun. I both say, what's the greater chiddush? Reuven was married to Rachel. Kitana. Reuven gives Rachel a get, right? Reuven remarries Rachel, and now Rachel does miyun. Rabbi say the greater chiddush is that what? Miyun doesn't just simply dissolve the marriage. What else does miyun dissolve? The get. The get. That's going to be the greater chiddush. So Alma, here it is. Alma asi miyun mevatel get. So I'll say, what do you see from here? That miyun has the ability to dissolve a get. In the same marriage, that's the case I just mentioned to you, that miyun has the ability literally to erase all marital history to the point that now Rachel is not considered to be a grusha to Reuven. She's considered to be a mima enes. And that's why if she subsequently marries Shimon and gets divorced from Shimon, she's permitted to come back to Reuven. Or Mino asks the question, hamima enes beish v'niseis. Right, a girl goes ahead and what? Does miyun to a man, and she gets married, right? La'acher v'girsha, she marries someone else, and then ultimately gets divorced. La'acher u'miyanabo, then she marries someone else and does miyun. La'acher v'girsha, and then she does, very busy girl, right? She goes ahead, then she marries someone else and ultimately gets divorced. What's talachar? What did the Mishnah say? Zaklal. We'll say if the marriage ended with a get, and the girl subsequently marries someone else, she cannot go back to that previous husband. B'miyun muteres lachzor. But if the marriage ended with miyun, then what? She is permitted to go back to that husband. Alma, now what do you see from this? Lo asi miyun dechavre ubatal gita didei. Then I both say, what you do see is something else. See, I both say, what miyun can do is at most, miyun can be mavatal the get within the same marriage. What can't miyun do? Miyun of one marriage can't be mavatal the get of another marriage. Now, both say, you'll think to yourself, what does that mean? Watch this. See, I might have thought like this. Look at these cases where the girl is marrying multiple men at different stages. See, I will say, she's getting out of some relationships with a get, some relationships out of miyun. When you look at this, continue to say, what's abundantly clear in this situation? What's the status of this girl? What's her status? She's a ketana, right? How do I know that she's a ketana? Because she's doing miyun here, and she's doing miyun. The good news is she's predictable. She's doing miyun every other marriage, right? So Lamaisa, again, I would have thought in a case like this, it's so clear that she's a ketana, her get should be meaningless. And really, she shouldn't have the status of a grusha for any of these husbands. That's what it means when it says, miyun didei mevatel gita da'acher. I would say that she's doing miyun every other marriage. It's clear that she's a ketana. So therefore, even the gittin should really be meaningless. And both say, what does that mean effectively? She should really be able to remarry who? Remarry who? Any of the people in this pool. Any of the people in this pool. But Elamai, you see that that's not the case. The way the Mishnah Paskins are both say is, if a marriage ends with a get, she is considered to be a grusha and can't go back to that particular husband. If the marriage ends with miyun, she can go back. So what do you see from here? Alma lo asi miyun dechavre batal gita didei. Amar Rabbi Shmuel Tavra. No. Misha shanazu lo shanazu. Must be two different tanoim. Two different tanoim. Most says machlokis. Amar Rava umay kushya. What's the question? Dilma miyun didei mevatel get didei. Miyun dechavre lo mevatel get didei. So I say, I don't understand. Maybe there's just a simple formula over here. When it's the same husband who's doing both get and miyun, his miyun is mevatel his get, which will say makes sense. Because if the marriage ends off with miyun, what does miyun effectively do? What is miyun, right? As opposed to a get that severs, what does miyun do? Erases. So miyun erases full marital history, as if there was never a get. But I will say, but again, when it comes to two distinct marriages, miyun of one marriage doesn't impact the get from another marriage. So I don't say why can't we just accept that? And I will say now, why is that? But why is that? So we'll say, see, the Gemara is bothered by the logic of it, because the logic should say, once there's miyun involved, it's so clear that we're dealing with a ketana. And once we're dealing with a ketana, why should the get have any lasting impact? So why is it that the miyun, right, the miyun of one marriage shouldn't be mevatel ultimately again the get of a different marriage? I'll tell you why. So therefore I will say, so the issue over here that we have is, we don't want to get into a situation where halacha lemaisa, what's going to happen? A woman is married to one man, and a previous husband is going to try to woo her back. We don't want that. We don't want that. So in order to go ahead and dissuade that, what Chazal did is, they said, if you're divorcing through a get, ultimately, again, this woman has the status of a grusha, and therefore you can't take her back. So in order to prevent this from occurring, they legislated this. To which the Gemara says, Miyun didei, nami lo lebatel gita didei, da'idi demichras bermizos krizos al mishabishu ma'isila. Shabbos Ba'alanstein, you can say the same thing with one man's miyun as well, right? We should say that his own miyun should not go to be mevatel his own get, ultimately out of concern that he's going to try to woo her back. To which the Gemara says, Hakvar shibsha v'lo ish basha. We assume that in that case already he tried to woo her back and it didn't work. Ela'i kasha dechabre kasha. So Rabbi says, so now again, what we're facing right now, Rabbi says, is the following: that Allah in the context of one marriage, one husband's miyun, or I should say, in one marriage, miyun erases all marital history, even if there's a get in there. So that when that marriage dissolves, she's looked at as a mima enes, and therefore she could go back to that first husband. As opposed to halacha l'maisa, if the marriage ends off with a get, halacha l'maisa, she's looked at as a grusha. And again, number 3, that halacha l'maisa, the miyun of one marriage does not in any way impact the get of another marriage. Ela'i kasha, dechare kasha. Both say, rather, here's the question. Miyun abo v'chzira, listen to this. If a husband, Reuven was married to Rachel, she did miyun, and now they remarried, miyun abo v'chzira, nasan la get. Now both say, now what happens? He gives her a get. So both say, so now what happens? It's the same case. Reuven's married to Rachel. She does miyun. They get remarried. Now they get divorced again. But this, not divorced again, now they get divorced. Reuven gives Rachel a get. Now Rachel marries Shimon. And what happens? The marriage with Shimon falls apart. So now she gets divorced or is widowed from Shimon. What's the halacha? Asur lachsur. She cannot go back to Reuven. Right? Rabbi says, since the marriage with Reuven ended with a get, she cannot go back to Reuven. Taima, listen to this. Taima dinis amar la'onis karsha. You could infer from this, the reason she can't go back to Reuven is why? Because she was widowed or divorced from Shimon. So the Gemara says, however, ha-miyana, it sounds like over here that what? Had she done miyun with Shimon, muteres lachzor lo, she would be permitted to go back to Reuven. Alma, we'll say, what does that show you? Asi miyun dechavre umevatel gita didei. We'll say, so what does that sound like? It sounds like the miyun of one husband could go and be mevatel the get of a second husband. So it sounds like I both say the case that the Mishnah is setting up. When can't she go back to Reuven? When she was widowed or divorced from Shimon. But it sounds like had she done miyun with Shimon, she would be permitted to go back to Reuven. What does that show you? That miyun of one marriage, in fact, undermines a get, not undermines, but negates or erases the get from a previous marriage. To which the Gemara says, or middle, raise a kasha to that. If a woman does miyun with a man and then gets married to someone else, she goes ahead and she gets a get from husband number 2, from Shimon, and then ultimately again she does miyun. If ultimately again she left the marriage with a get, she cannot remarry that husband. But if she left the marriage with miyun, she can return to the marriage. Alma. Rather, Rabbi says, so what do you see from here? You see from here that miyun of one marriage cannot negate a get from a different marriage. Rabbi Lazar, Tavra, Misha Shanazu, Lo Shanazu. 2 different opinions. Two different opinions. So we'll stop over here for today, but just understand what we're ending off with. We're ending off, we'll say here's what we have solidified. Within one marriage, the halacha is that what? That if there was a get and then a miyun, if the marriage ends with miyun, what does that do? Erases all marriage history. So she's not a grusha, she's a mima'enes, and therefore again, even if she subsequently remarries, she could go, but let's say that marriage ends, she could go back and marry first husband. That everyone agrees with. What's the point of contention about saying? Where there's multiple marriages, some of them are ending with get, some of them are ending with miyun. What's the machlokes? Could miyun of one marriage undermine get of different marriage? Or in other words, do we say that since we see miyun happening in other relationships, therefore what? Halacha lemaisa, it's clear that she's a ketana, therefore the get has no effect, and she shouldn't be a grusha from any of the marriages, and should be able to return to any of the previous husbands. That's the point of contention. Resolution in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chevra Zoom, everyone have a great day.